thank you everybody, and particularly those who actually showed up, which is wonderful to see everyone and so forth. As Eileen said, I am Doug McConnell, and we're going to talk about swimming tonight, but really in the context of a bigger issue, and that really has to do with audacious goals. You know, it's not every day you decide to wake up and swim the English Channel, and so we started to sort of put the pieces together of why these really sort of became a goal-setting exercise and so forth. I'm an investment banker, and I have a small firm here in town called Visant Capital. And one of the things that I started to realize after we had completed some of these swims is that there are a lot of analogs with my business, investment banking. It's a project-oriented. You know, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and so on. And there are a lot of analogs with some of the things that we've been doing with our swims. So we started to figure out how to tell that story using swimming as some of the illustrations and so forth. You know, and a project can be anything. It doesn't have to be an investment banking transaction or a swim or anything like that. It could be, you know, getting a patent for a new product. It could be getting a big sale. Or one of my sisters is a Spanish teacher, and I think her goal would be just to have everybody bring their homework in every day. So that as we started to sort of look at these goals and figure out how to kind of knock them down, I borrowed a quote from my son Gordy, who's in the back of the room, after he explained to me, as only a 17-year-old at the time could explain, what he saw as the accomplishment of, in that case it was the English Channel. And he didn't use the word audacious, he used the word ridiculous. But fair enough, and so forth. But we kind of broke it down into the pieces, and it was to sort of see the goal, kind of dream that dream, and then imagine the elements that were necessary to put it together. To try to put together a project like this, a swim, is a little bit unique. There's not a place, there's not a volume in the library here that you can look up and learn about it. There's no website you can go to and see a how-to manual. So it was a lot of learning on our part to try to figure out how to do that. Finally, putting the pieces in place and hoping like crazy that you have controlled enough of the things that can be controlled that it can actually be accomplished. You know, when it comes to marathon swimming, there are enough things that can go wrong that you cannot control, that you better enjoy the process along the way too, because sometimes you don't make it to the finish line, and so that's you hope the process was enjoyable in the process along the way. We're often asked how this all started. I was a swimmer for many years. In fact, this is my 50th year as a competitive swimmer. I literally started in 1964 with an age group swimming program for the Dundee Park District over in East Dundee. At the time, Dundee did not have an indoor pool. So if you wanted to swim year-round, you pretty much were relegated to the Elgin Y down in Elgin. As I got into high school and more serious about swimming, a coach contacted me from Elgin High School, a guy that I had known for many years, and he said, you know, would you like to train with us? Just come in, and no meets or anything, like just come in and train with us. And it was a gift really to be able to do that. And he even showed me a door at the backside of Elgin High School that I could sneak in without being too obtrusive and so forth. So for a couple of seasons, I managed to do that. I went to the University of Illinois. I wanted to swim in college. There was no scholarship money available or anything, so I was a walk-on at the University of Illinois, where I swam with Tom Fay. Again, the hard work kind of paid off. I was able to end up as most valuable a couple of years and a team captain as a senior. The other thing that I did as a senior in college was I was 18th in NCAA's in my event, which was the 200 butterfly. And I bring this up only because what I really wanted to do was be an All-American. And to be an All-American, you had to be 16th place. And the difference between 16th and 18th that year was 7/100ths of a second. And I've been kind of chapped about those 7/100ths of a second for now 35 years. And I will say though that I probably could figure out who the 17 guys were that beat me in the 200 butterfly that year I know for a fact I didn't see a single one of them when we were standing on the beach in Dover. But so some years ago, I kept training as an adult and so forth, and about 10 years ago, I started to do some open water swims and events. Hey, Red. Started to get into open water swims and realized they're very different from pool swimming. You don't really know where you're going, and all of the variables that a pool takes away, the wind and the waves and the wildlife and all the things that can kind of get in your way, are sort of reintroduced. And so it was a new challenge and kind of fun to train again. As the distances got longer, the challenges got a little heavier. We actually started to talk about the English Channel in 2009 and discovered that it takes a couple of years to get a reservation. So we set those wheels in motion. But while we were doing that, there were a number of training swims that we did, and this is not an exhaustive list of the swims that I did. But I think that again, sort of tying back to a business context, you learn a little bit from each of these swims that you do. And the mistakes you make, the failures that you have, and so forth. I mean, I look at this list, I see the Boston Light Swim, it was, it was an 8-mile swim is all, but it was in 54-degree water. And so a pretty chilly day for 3 hours and 3 minutes, if I remember correctly. But some of these others, you take away a little bit from each one, and often you learn more from the mistakes and the missteps than you otherwise would. This is Tampa Bay, where we swam a 24-mile swim as kind of a shakedown cruise. And for those of you, if I can do this, for those of you who know Tampa, let's see, Clearwater's up here, St. Petersburg somewhere. This is the Sunshine Causeway, and you swim this way up to right by the Tampa airport. It's 24 miles, and it's spectacular, especially after a cold winter in Chicago. 24 miles in Tampa Bay was a real luxury. This is a picture from that swim. It was a beautiful day. We thought those were big waves. We were wrong. But we also learned about how things can go wrong. For example, after a long cold winter in Chicago, this was Easter weekend of 2011, and it was 80-some degrees. Everybody got sunburned. And so, word to the wise, let's be smart about this the next time to consider things like sunburn and all the rest. We also used it as kind of as they say, a shakedown cruise for our English Channel swim, which was a few months later, to get our feeding cycles down right, our teamwork, and to make sure everybody kind of knew what they were doing and so forth. The other introduction we had in the Tampa Bay swim was jellyfish. And we'll get back to the jellyfish here in a little bit. Hey, Mark. And but that was a 10-hour and 44-minute swim, and a real introduction to what open water ocean swimming was all about. In August 2011, I think most people have probably heard about this. This is the English Channel, just to get sort of a orientation of the map, England is up to the left. This is the French coast down here. Everybody starts in Dover, and you want to end up right there, which is Cap Grenay, where there's a lighthouse, and it's the shortest distance between the two. As the crow flies, that's 21 miles. The circuitous route that we took is one that swimmers have to take because of tides and currents. You simply can't swim across. Even boats have to accommodate for those tides and currents. Each of the little X's on the red line represents a 30-minute segment. After all those 30-minute segments, you can believe we were pretty happy to make it to the Vicente Bay. Again, just to sort of give you the map orientation, the part of the English Channel that the GIs crossed in 1944 for D-Day is way down south of this, and they probably crossed 3 or 4 times the distance that we did across the English Channel, and of course had the weather and so forth that they were so famous for. So, this is a channel that's 21 miles across. It takes most people about 30. It took me 33 miles to that long red line is 33 miles long. As the certificate says, 14 hours and 18 minutes later, we stumbled up on the beach. We had some challenges on that swim. one of which was big waves for the first several hours, and some of which kind of rolled me over. This was a photograph that Susan got that I just couldn't help but use. But between the waves and the dark and the cold, 14 hours and 18 minutes couldn't come soon enough. Our Catalina swim is kind of interesting. This is Santa Catalina Island, right down here, and you swim from the Catalina up to Rancho Palos Verdes, which is actually a little bit west of Long Beach in LA County. And there are times that this 21-mile swim swims like 15, because you get a south to north current, and there are times that it goes from north to south, and unfortunately we were on one of the north to south days. So that was a current that was kind of on the nose the whole day, and it took us 12 hours and 41 minutes, so figure it swims like 27 miles that way. But a very exciting swim. We learned an awful lot, particularly compared with the English Channel. Look at how flat that water is. I mean, Sherry will tell us that there are days on Lake Zurich that are bigger waves than this. But and that's what the Catalina Channel looked like that day. So just perfectly placid and flat. That was a photograph that Susan took that really kind of captured it. As you can imagine, Pacific, California, the beautiful, clear, crystal blue water, and so forth. We have some jellyfish stories later, but this is where we really learned about jellyfish, and it was kind of interesting. Let me see if I can go back just for a second. On this map, there's a very interesting thing that happens in this channel. And it has to do with how deep this channel is. It's very deep. It's like a 5,000-foot depth along here. And then as the prevailing weather comes from the west, it pushes the water against the shore, against the wall that is California, the mainland of California. And what happens is then there's this upwelling of cold water from 3,000 to 4,000 feet deep that kind of comes up all of a sudden. And I had read about this. I'd been told about it by other swimmers. And so I knew that this upwelling was going to come and that the water was going to get very cold. But it hit so abruptly, it was so interesting that the water went from 68 to 60 in about 200 strokes. So that was one of the challenges of the Catalina swim. This last June, we managed to get around the island of Manhattan in New York. So many people have been to New York. And of course, Manhattan is a long, skinny north-south island. The start of the race is at Battery Park, which is down by where the World Trade Centers used to be. You swoop around the south end of the island, and they time the start so that you have an incoming tide that pushes you north on the East River. And we'll see some pictures here in a bit, but you go like a locomotive up the East River. It's wonderful. And in fact, we went from Battery Park to the United Nations building, which is at about 48th Street, in an hour. And I dare say there are times of the day you couldn't do that in a taxi cab. So as you go up the East River, then you get to Hell's Gate, which is this area. I don't know the origin of the name other than to say it's where the East River and the Harlem River come together and the water kind of swirls a bit. We had some kind of interesting experiences because of Hell's Gate. You get into the Harlem River, which is very narrow, separates Harlem from Bronx. That goes from 110th Street to about 210th Street. A button hook left puts you into the Hudson River, and then it's downstream back to Battery Park. So that was New York. A quick story about the first bridge that you go under is the Brooklyn Bridge. And of course, a magnificent bridge. Everybody's been across the Brooklyn Bridge in a taxi and so on. As we started the swim, it was a beautiful day, and I knew that the first bridge that we were coming to was the Brooklyn Bridge. So as I was swimming along, I felt the shadow come over my head, and I thought, okay, here it is. And this is a swim where there are a couple of dozen swimmers. There were 23 swimmers that day. So on the one hand, I realized, I'm in a race here. On the other hand, I am never going to see the Brooklyn Bridge from this angle again. So I whipped over on my back and floated by and watched it go by. I think the people on the boat were a little concerned, but I did get to see the Brooklyn Bridge from underneath, and it is like a work of art. Spectacularly beautiful. This is a 29-mile swim, but because 2 of the legs are downstream, it swims more like 20. All of these swims have a whole bunch of rules, and they used to call them English Channel rules that all the other swims have kind of embraced. Most importantly, you can't get warm and you can't be buoyant. The rule is no wetsuits because, again, for insulation and buoyancy reasons, they're prevented. Hence, you are in a Speedo cap and a goggle, and that's your entire sort of costume, as the Brits would say. Another real important rule is that you cannot touch the escort boat or anyone on the escort boat. That's considered then an assisted swim and doesn't fall under the same marathon swimming rules. In most cases, they want you to have a dry land start and finish. So from a dry beach, you start, and then the finish is also from a dry beach. The English Channel adds a couple of little twists on its own. All swims these days have to originate in England. The French decided that it's just too dangerous, so they won't let you do that. In fact, the French decided that if you do make it to their beach, you've got 15 minutes to get off their beach, and so they're pretty militant about that. So just like business challenges that we come up against, there are lots and lots of rules to adhere to, but there's only one requirement to swim the English Channel, and that is to be able to prove a qualification swim that you can handle cold water. So a minimum of 6 hours in a maximum of 61-degree water, and that's pretty chilly, to be sure. When we did our qualification swim, we actually did it in Lake Zurich, right over here. Waited until the water got cold enough. It happened that it was a pretty day, and just swam around and around and around for 6 hours and punched our ticket. So it was so you can do that qualification swim really anywhere, but they want to make sure that people can take sustained exposure to cold water. So as we knew what we were up against, at least with respect to these rules and some of the horror stories and so forth. Now what we wanted to do was kind of imagine what we needed to put in place to make this really work. And obviously recruiting the team was probably first, second, and third priorities. And I'm remembering a conversation that I had with Susan, and this was in '09 when we were first making heavy conversations about swimming the English Channel. And I said, look, this is really crazy. This is really nutso, and I understand if you don't want to do this, that's okay. It's going to be a big sacrifice for our family. It's a lot of time away, a lot of training time, and so on. And if it's just not your cup of tea, it's not that big of a deal to me. We'll do something else. And she thought about it. Actually, thought about it for a couple of days, and came back and said, no, if this is a swim you want to do and you think you can do, you probably ought to go do it. Second, she said, we've got all these kids, and you need a team. So why don't we put those two together instead of bringing along other marathon swimmers, other people that might really make that sacrifice hard? Why don't we teach the kids how to do this? We've got a couple of years, and we can do training swims and so forth, and really figure this out. So that conversation just made all the difference in the world. We were able to talk the kids into it and kind of get going, and of course, because of Susan's brilliant idea, as we put together the org chart, she was clearly the candidate for the CEO. The kids then became, sort of settled into their roles as we went along. Our friend Megan, who's here, was the official time and scorekeeper, and then there's me in the Speedo. But the interesting thing about this is that we had a real non-standard team for marathon swimming. Most marathon swims are done with other marathon swimmers, where you have other experienced people, and we are this is not a group of the as Ellen would say, the MBAs of open water swimming. Susan's a photographer, and we took advantage of that. She took beautiful photographs and videos throughout all these swims, and we were able to capitalize with those on social media and so forth. Megan is the project manager that everybody has dreams about. She's my favorite picture of Meg is her sitting on the deck of one of the boats. I don't remember which one, with the logbook open in front of her, 3 wristwatches on so she could keep different times and cycles of things, and kind of directing everybody like Leonard Bernstein used to do with the Philharmonic. And it was, you know, I look at Billy as a wonderful guy, and absolutely somebody that you'd want if you were ever in a pinch. He can figure out your way through it. So as everybody kind of figured out their roles, we all learned each other's roles so we could kind of cross-train and take advantage of that. It worked out beautifully. This was a team photo that we had taken in Dover for a very narrow group of people in the world. This is like going to Graceland. This statue is Captain Matthew Webb, who was the first fellow to swim across the English Channel, actually in 1875. Any number of people had died both before and after Captain Webb to try to do that. But it, you know, everybody has to have their picture taken at Dover Harbor in front of this ugly apartment building with Captain Webb. Another quick story, when we arrived in England, we ended up swimming very quickly after we arrived. So the first time we met our boat pilot was when we were there to swim. And so I introduced myself and shook Lance's hand and so forth, and he looked over my shoulder and he said, "Now, who are all these kids?" And I said, "Well, that's our team." He thought, "But you don't even have matching jackets or caps or anything, you know, and this is the motley crew." And I said, "No, but we really know what we're doing and we're ready to go," and so forth. So it was, you know, it was kind of interesting to watch other people's reactions to having a kind of a non-standard team, it really added to the experience. One other sort of project within the project. Billy, who was the big guy in the tan jacket here, came to me at one point during our training, and he said, you know, these escort, you know, being your escort in a canoe for these swims and training swims and whatnot, he said, working out pretty well. And I said, yeah, it's working, you know, it's great. You guys come along and stuff. And he goes, well, you know, there are going to be times that Gordy can't come, or, you know, so there will only be one of them. And he said, trying to manage the canoe just, you know, alone is really hard. Yeah, you're right. And I said, well, what do we do? He said, well, we really need a kayak. And I said, okay, yeah, I guess we probably need a kayak. And so I'm thinking, you know, Craigslist, or where do I get a cheap kayak, you know, something like that. And he said, no. He said, I've been looking this up on the internet, and he said, we can get a kit. We can put this thing together, maybe do it ourselves, in the garage, have a lot of fun doing it, and then we'll get a kayak out of it. So as a teammate, you hope that somebody comes up with not only anticipating a problem, but comes up with a solution, and the result is this beautiful boat that he really kind of quarterbacked and is a really kind of a work of art. So as we thought about the other elements to this thing, you know, not that we needed to keep everybody's motivation high, but there was an opportunity to really rally behind a cause and use a charitable element of this whole thing. And that was really easy for everybody to kind of get behind.
I'm standing here on the beach in Dover Harbor in England, which is near the point where I started to swim across the English Channel a few days ago. One of the real important drivers of that swim was the support of the Les Turner ALS Foundation in suburban Chicago. ALS is a disease that has hit my family pretty hard. I lost my father
photo of my folks from several years ago, back before my dad was diagnosed with ALS. And he was a big, strong guy and physically very powerful and so forth. Was a practicing veterinarian for 35 years, and I watched him pick up enormous dogs and push around dairy cattle and things like that. So he was a pretty strong, had been quite an athlete himself. Curiously, all of this took place really all of our swims took place after he died. And I think often about how he would laugh his head off because he often thought that distance swimming was one of the most boring things that he had ever seen. You know, one of the things, this was a great summer to be involved with raising money for ALS because of the Ice Bucket Challenge that sort of swept through social media and whatnot, and for ALS charities raised more than $100 million this summer. And Barrington was part of that. The Ice Bucket Challenge was a big deal. It happened right next to Susan's studio, and this was a little video that she had put together with respect to our Barrington. I will say that with respect to the cause and having our team sort of support ALS research and so forth, there was an almost magical coincidence that happened, and it was on August 22nd, 2011. It happened to be the day that we finished swimming the English Channel, and there was a major research announcement that came from Northwestern that day, where all of the Les Turner money goes for research. And the researchers, after looking for 35 years, found the common cause of this disease. And I mean, I could argue that this is the biggest news in ALS since Lou Gehrig died in the 40s. But to have that happen on the same day that we completed the English Channel swim was almost karmic in its coincidence. As I said in that little video, we originally had hoped to raise $50,000. Very recently, we crossed $350,000, and we're not going to be stopping swimming anytime soon. So with all of that as the backdrop, now it's time to really prepare yourself for one of these swims. Again, the systematic approach that you would take a project if it were part of your business or a transaction and so forth. One of the challenges with this is, with marathon swimming, is that there's no easy place to look things up. You can look on the internet, and there's a lot of different resources, but it's bits and pieces from a lot of different places. There's no one manual, one recipe book that kind of works for everyone. I was reminded of a quote from Mark Twain, who said that education was the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. And there's really a lot to that. I mean, you're happy while you're ignorant and blissful. The first thing we did was we tried to find some folks who would be really expert at things that we were not. By total coincidence, Marcia Cleveland lives 20 miles from here and is considered one of the world's best marathon swimmers and marathon swim coaches. She was aboard right away and was indispensable. We still train together, have become very close friends. Bob Lee, whom many of you know right here in Barrington, was a bit of a rabbi for all of the work that he had done with his Ride for Three Reasons and all of the charitable work that he has done. And then finally, you're just left to talk to other English Channel swimmers. Talking to other swimmers and what their experience was, nutrition and where to stay. I mean, silly questions. And everybody was so forthcoming and so on. There's almost an unwritten rule that if you've done one of these swims, you really owe it to the next guy coming up the ladder to help him out a little bit. And now that I'm in a position where I can help, it's so flattering to be considered by some of these folks who are looking for the same information that we did. Of course, the training itself is a grind. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. 6 days a week, whether it's a pool or a lake or wherever. I go early in the morning only because that's what I'm accustomed to. And whenever the lakes are above 55 degrees, we're outdoors. And the cold water acclimation is nice, but it's just nice to be outdoors and get out of the feeling of being a hamster on a wheel when you're in a short course pool indoors. We also learned about nutrition. One of the things especially in cold water swims, you have to budget for 1,000 to 1,200 calories an hour. Unlike some of the marathons and cycle racing and so forth, electrolytes are not a big deal with marathon swimming. It's all calories. And the issue is how to most efficiently get you those calories, and it's carbohydrate. So the drink that I use is actually a custom blend of a real high carbohydrate drink that you try to drink as fast as you can during these feeding stops. You can't replace 1,000 calories an hour. You can't synthesize that many, but you try to minimize that deficit over a period of time. As we said earlier about the rule with marathon swimming that you cannot touch a person on the boat or the boat itself. So again, our team, Gordy and Billy, came up with a solution, and it was this feeding stick, which it looks suspiciously like a paint roller extension pole, and that's attached to a basket at the end that has the feeding bottles in it. It worked beautifully, and it was a great solution that they had come up with, refined a little bit, and so forth. One of the things that we didn't think about was how difficult it would be to get a paint roller extension pole on United Airlines. So we ended up having to check it and lug it. A $5 pole, we had to pay to check and lug it. But anyway, it was a great solution, and I was so pleased that they had come up with it. Another thing that we learned together was about counting strokes. I started counting strokes some years ago to try to get a bad song out of my head, and discovered that it was a way to gauge both time and distance. and it worked pretty well. In addition, the crew does a 60-second stroke count for me every 10 minutes. And it's really for safety reasons. In cold water swims, if hypothermia is starting to become an issue, typically your stroke count will fall dramatically. And so for safety reasons, they do this 1-minute stroke count in 10-minute intervals. They keep it in a logbook, keeps everybody on the same page. It's a good way to kind of keep score and gauge how your process is coming along. This was also a photograph in Tampa Bay of a greeting from a jellyfish. Having grown up in the Midwest, I was unfamiliar with jellyfish. I was also unaware that I'm allergic to them. And so when this guy wrapped around my arm, I was pretty startled. I also had this reaction to it. I was sneezing uncontrollably, and my stomach tied up really badly. And I was mostly worried about the stomach, only because I was a third of the way through this swim, and if I couldn't process calories, it was going to be a short day. I didn't want to get in the boat. So Susan happened to have some Sudafed in her camera bag, which I took. I swam another 1,000 strokes and thought, okay, well, it's not right, but I'm not bad, so I'll just keep going. Anyway, it was a great lesson to be learned before we went to England, where they're famous for their jellyfish, and how to deal with that kind of ahead of time. This was a picture a few days after Tampa. The lashes on my arm are what are left from the jellyfish, some of which are still there. And that big rubbed off place on my shoulder is where my chin had taken the skin off of my shoulders as I breathed. And so we wanted to make sure we addressed that also by the time we got to England and so forth. But I've still got those handsome scars. Every story, has a setback, has some drama to it, and so forth. Ours is no different. Sometimes when you're working on a deal, you've negotiated with a guy for 6 months, and all of a sudden he's out of a job. The report is late. Something else goes wrong that becomes a setback, and it really has to do with how you deal with it. In our case, it was spinal surgery. I ended up with a badly herniated disc in my neck, and ultimately pretty well lost the use of my left arm. And rather than have the traditional spinal fusion surgery for that repair, Susan suggested that we go to some of the teaching hospitals in Chicago and learned about this fabulous replacement disc, which is the little gizmo on the left. It's actually the size of a 50-cent piece. And that was screwed into my spine early one morning. And so now the picture on the right is what I look like when I go through O'Hare Field. But the best part about this was that it was the perfect solution for me. And I now have been coached by the people at Medtronic to say that my results may not be typical. And in fact, they are not typical, because I was home the same day from surgery. I went to vote the next day. I was off painkillers the day after that. 6 weeks later, I was back in the swimming pool, and 8 weeks after that, I was in a 10K race. So my results are not typical. I was the luckiest guy you'll ever meet. It's interesting because I've become a bit of a poster child for Medtronic. Not only have they been huge donors to A Long Swim, but now they also fly me around the country and have me do motivational talks for their salespeople and some of the others. So I was very fortunate with that, and we were able to kind of put that setback behind us. So now that we have kind of figured out what we were doing and have put the pieces in place, we have controlled what we think we can control, understanding that there are plenty of things that we can't control. We got the whole team over to England, this in August of 2011, trying to get from London to Dover on the wrong side of the road and find the apartment and move in, and there was a lot of sort of chasing around. That evening, we were going to dinner, and the kids, of course, said, well, we're in England, let's go for fish and chips. So we went for fish and chips, and as we were wrapping up our dinner, Susan suggested that I call my boat pilot just to tell him I was in town and so forth. I wasn't expecting to swim for several days, but I just wanted to check in with Mike and let him know that, that we were in town, and ended up with the shock of my life.
Have the other people for this side checked in yet?
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, Mike.
Okay, we'll talk soon. You bet. Bye now. Could go as soon as tomorrow.
So what did he say?
He said that they're already on their second swimmer for this tide. They're on a two-way. And he said Lance took somebody this morning, and if the weather looks good by midday tomorrow, they could try to get somebody out there.
So leave at midday?
Mid-afternoon, yeah.
And then it's going to tell you what?
Middle of the night.
You better get home.
So Susan's reaction is to get everybody to bed, which is perfect. But the long and short of it was that everybody was a little wigged out about this. I mean, we were all exhausted from the trip and still a little loopy from the jet lag and so forth. But I told them, I said, look, we came here for one reason, and that was to see if we can get across the channel. What you didn't hear from that phone conversation is that Mike Oram also told me that there may be this window tomorrow, but after that, the weather's going to really get bad, and it's going to be several days before anybody's going to get across. So he encouraged me to take that window of time if I could bear to. So a few hours later, we find ourselves on the boat, headed to the starting line, and Susan's putting some channel grease around my shoulders, really to address that chafing problem that we had in the Florida swim. It's go time. So the channel grease doesn't really help for insulation. Excuse me. So we only put it around my shoulders, and it looks pretty gross, but it works for that chafing problem. Now the next little video is the start of the swim, unlike things like the Chicago Marathon where there are 40,000 people cheering you on and so forth. There's one guy and his dog on the beach, and we said earlier that you have to start and finish on dry land. So the boat can only get you so close to the beach, and then you have to swim to the starting line until they blow a horn and you can begin. One other little twist on this video: when I was a pool swimmer, I was a butterflyer, and I don't know about the backstrokers, but I'm still in touch with a lot of the the swimmers that I swam with. And as I told guys that I was planning for this swim and so forth, almost every one of them said, "Oh, so are you going to swim at butterfly?" And the answer was no, I was not going to swim at butterfly, but I did want to swim butterfly in the English Channel. I figured there would never be another trash-talking opportunity that would present itself like that.
So, back, folks. Wanted to go? Okay, go. All right. Have a good one. Wait.
Billy?
What?
Son.
Go!
possibility of swimming the English Channel, and all of a sudden you find yourself in the English Channel. By about the time you get out of Dover Harbor, you realize this is going to be a really long day. And so the little golf tees that you see in the C shape at the top is our swim. The ones at the lower part was the swimmer from the previous day. You know, nothing will ever turn marathon swimming into a spectator sport, but this really helps. This is a GPS a signal that goes out every 10 minutes and pops up one of these little golf tees, and it really just underscores to me a couple things. Number one, this is fabulous technology, and technology that wasn't available 20 years ago, let alone 120 years ago, and we were great beneficiaries of it. In addition, you know, it really sort of points up how important the boat pilot is, to be able to know how to work these currents and so forth. The good news is that we had a Hall of Fame boat pilot, and he was a super guy. You know, this was a screenshot of the traffic that was in the English Channel at a moment in time that day, and it looks very chaotic. It's not as chaotic as it looks, but there are a lot of ships up and down that channel every day, some 600 a day. This is our little boat called the Sea Satin right there. But you think about these ocean-going tankers and container ships and so forth are going by, and they're all speaking different languages. They're all trying to be alerted by the one guy who's got a slow swimmer with him and so forth. So it just underscores the importance of that teammate, the boat pilot, as a real critical member of this whole thing. So we had dealt with the cold, we'd figured out the traffic, or Lance had figured out the traffic and the currents. What we hadn't counted on was the waves, and it was pretty windy when we started, and we had some waves that day. Swimming is a very rhythmic activity and so forth. When in waves like that, it's very hard to get your cadence. Those waves happen to be some of the smaller ones, so Susan could actually have a footing so that she could take the video. Unfortunately, as I was being slapped around by these waves, it didn't occur to me how dreadful the conditions were on the boat. Ashley was kind of in tough shape. Billy wasn't much better. Understand Ashley did spend some time at the transom of the boat and finally was able to kind of conk out. You know, and as you know, if anybody's had motion sickness, it's just horrible, and it just doesn't go away. I mean, you know, it's just horrible, and so I was glad that I didn't know about this, because I would have been worried. But again, who steps up but Gordy? So, not sick at all. Here he's a happy guy, doing well and so forth. Never got sick. Had no adverse reaction at all. It really ended up being the superstar of this swim. He was the unanimous most valuable player on that team, and was indispensable that day. One of the things that he and Billy had done was figure out a new feeding system. We had that stick thing that we had with the paint roller extension pole, and they quickly realized that if we had used that in those heavy waves, somebody was going to die, and it was probably me. So on the fly completely, they put together a whole new feeding system, which was twine, and there was duct tape involved, and I'm not sure what all, but so they figured this out, because they knew what needed to be done, and they crafted a solution. This next little video is what a typical feeding stop kind of looks like, where I actually have some time to complain to the boat pilot, but you'll see there's a lot going on in a short period of time.
Cricket's way, killing it.
They're almost done. Got the still count? 17,600.
So during these feeding stops, which you try to keep to 30 seconds or less, only because if it lasts longer than that, you're liable to get cold, and once you get cold, you're liable to get out. And so you try to keep these feeding stops very short. The water that day, by the way, it was 62 degrees water temperature the whole way. But I don't know if you heard it, the last part of the clip, Gordy asked me what the stroke count was, and I said 17,600. I was keeping a running stroke count the whole way. And then, of course, they were doing their once every 10-minute cycles as well. At one point, during one feeding stop, I said to Lance Oram, who was driving the boat, I said, by my count, we should be just about halfway. Or I said a mile past halfway. And he looked at his screen, and he looked at me, and he couldn't believe, he said, how do you know that? And we were within a few hundred yards of where I thought we were on the map. That's how predictable that stroke counting can be. And in case anybody's taking notes, it is 40,538 strokes to get across the English Channel.
So what is a stroke? Is it this? Is that a stroke? Or is this
One arm
and
per number.
this?
No, it's one per arm.
One per arm, okay.
Right, not per cycle. So one of the last photographs that Susan was able to take before the sun went down was this one. Obviously a beautiful photograph, but it was about 8:30 at night. We were halfway through the swim at that point. The waves were starting to dissipate a bit, which was nice. That ship in the background is a ferry that goes between Dover and Calais, France. While it looks like we're right in the wake of that ship, we're not. That boat is 700 feet long, and it's probably a half a mile away. But you can also see a container ship kind of behind it, it just gives you an idea that there's an awful lot to watch out for as you go along. So as it started to get dark, our little trail of golf tees is growing. This is a screenshot that a friend of mine sent. It was about midnight. I'm sorry. It was 7 o'clock Eastern time, so midnight where we were. And we're starting to approach the French coast and so forth. And of course, for us, it was just as dark could be. In this country, you imagine seashore, and you picture beautiful homes and lamps, street lamps, and car headlights, and that sort of thing. On this coast of Normandy, there is nothing. And so you're just swimming along. You don't realize the shore is coming or not. One of the things that we did as we were kind of anticipating going and knowing that we could be swimming at dark is built some night goggles. And again, these are not something you can buy from the REI catalog or anything. So what we did was we put these little blinkers together on my goggles that are actually built for bicycles at night. Obviously, it would work like a headlight, but it would allow a car or something like that to see you. I was hoping that they would be waterproof enough that we could make it across, and some of them did. But you can see from some of these videos that if you didn't have these blinkers, you could really lose somebody out there. I mean, it's that dark. And so as we were approaching the French shore, we were now getting very close. And at one point, Lance poked his head out of the pilot house and he said, "We're there." And I looked around and there was nothing there that I could see. And he said, "No, I'm in shallow water. I can't go any further." And he said, "What I do have is a spotlight and I will shine it on the water." He said, "Think of it like a keyhole of light and just swim through that keyhole, and in 100 yards you'll be on a sand beach." So I've been following this guy for 14 hours. I figured might as well keep going. So 100 yards later, he was right. I felt the sand under my hand and so forth. And it was then the challenge was trying to stand up, which was a little bit hard after all that time. This next little video is actually that keyhole of light, and I apologize because it's a little longer than it should be, but it's the finish. And what we're waiting to hear is that same air horn that we had when we started.
It's Sammy! He's like, oh. 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 No. Yay! Does it show up good on your camera too? No. He's doing it to you.
Thank you. Susan, of course, alerted everybody on Facebook, people who had been staying up all day to watch this craziness and so forth. You'll see that almost 100 people responded. You know, that was 3 years ago. If it were now, there would be probably 3 times that number of responses. But again, we were the great beneficiaries of the use of some technology. Now, so we have the people on the boat. I was on the beach where they had just, they could kind of see me to blow the horn and so forth. And I know the rule is that the French want you off the beach in 15 minutes. I didn't last anywhere near 15 minutes because I got so cold so fast standing on that beach. And again, it's 3 in the morning. I was in a wet Speedo. I had been swimming for 14 hours, and the air temperature was down to 46. So I got so cold so quickly, but I had told Susan that I would bring a stone or a shell or something from the beach back to her on the boat as some sort of a memento or whatever. And so I was on my hands and knees trying to feel around and couldn't see anything because it was so dark. And so I finally was getting so cold. It was scary how quickly I got cold. I thought, you know what, we'll get a rock some other time. Because then the last thing that you have to do is swim back to the boat, and which is 100 yards offshore or whatever. And so for me, the real finish line was being able to climb back on the boat and kind of rejoin the team that were out there. And that's what this next one is.
Oh, the Pacific Play Line.
There it is. Almost here. What?
not exactly like a Rocky moment. There's no brass band, there's no, you are an Ironman, there's none of that stuff as you cross the finish line on a swim like this. But it is mighty fulfilling to be able to do that. In so doing, we ended up being the 48th person over the age of 50 to swim the English Channel, and once again, my time is 18th. I don't know what but it was such an experience, it was such a great experience for our team and family and so forth. We decided to keep at it and signed on for the Catalina swim a year later, and this is now 2012. Catalina is an interesting swim because you start in the middle of the night. There are a couple of reasons for that. Calmer water in the middle of the night and so forth. Plus, the finish of that swim is very treacherous, and it's not one that you would want to do when you couldn't see everything you're getting into. So the other thing that's nice about the Catalina swim is that you're able to use a kayak in addition to the motorboat, so you can sort of swim between them, and it feels like you're kind of swimming down the freeway. This is an early... and it's just as dark in the Catalina Channel as it is in the English Channel, we learned. Susan was in the kayak. That was Mac, actually, in the kayak on that shot, I think. But Susan ended up in the kayak for 4 hours in the pitch black dark. And I remember at one, and she was terrified. I mean, it was really scary out there. I can appreciate that. And at one feeding stop, I stopped and asked if she was doing okay, and she said, you know what, if one of those sharks comes, it better take me in one bite, because I am not ever doing this again. So as we got to sunrise in the Catalina Channel, you see how placid this water is, and it was just wonderful, especially after the experience that we had over in England. The downside of such calm water, though, is that there are a lot of jellyfish. And this was a swim where we would go through what they call shoals of jellyfish, and I would be stung every 8 or 10 strokes for 600 strokes. And then I wouldn't have any at all for a couple of miles, and then I would get a bunch of little zingers again. And they weren't the life-threatening kind that you see in the Caribbean or in Australia and other places, but they were sure annoying, and it was like a little bee sting every few strokes. The worst, though, was getting jellyfish caught around the little nose piece of your goggles, and then they would lay against your nose, and it felt like somebody holding a steam iron on your face. And for those you stop, you swear, you pull it off, and you kind of move on. One of the other things that's kind of funny about the Catalina Channel, we were able to engage the best boat pilot out there. Greg Elliott is this fellow's name, and he's a very experienced guy. And his deal is that if you're swimming well, he greets the morning, the sunrise, with a bagpipe serenade. I mean, how crazy and random could that be? And I was getting sort of down at that point in the swim. We'd been going all night and so forth, and I thought, oh, I'm just not swimming well enough to deserve the bagpipes. And so when he was tuning up those pipes on one of these feeding stops, I was thrilled. And he even played Scotland the Brave for me, so it was a real treat to be able to do that. So getting on toward the finish of the Catalina swim, this is Terranea Beach at Rancho Palos Verdes, and I don't know if you can see, but it's real rocky, and as you get close to that beach, the rocks are either real slippery or terribly sharp. And so it was pretty treacherous getting up that beach, and I'm glad I didn't try it in the middle of the night. The other thing that was real special about this finish is that the Catalina Channel Swim Association will allow you to have pace swimmers. And so my friend Don McDonald and my son Mac both got in with me, and we all got to swim to the beach together. So that was really a highlight of the whole thing. So 12 hours and 41 minutes later, we staggered up on yet another beach, and were able to punch our ticket for 2 legs of the Triple Crown. and thought, okay, well now that we've done these two, why don't we take a run at Manhattan? And it's a very different swim because it's a group swim. 23 swimmers that day, and everybody kind of going around. They all had their own escort boats and whatnot. But it was a pretty exciting day, in part because I knew of many of the other swimmers in the race, but I just never met them before. And so it was kind of exciting to be able to meet all these people that you knew or felt like you had known and talked to on the phone and so forth. It was about half men and women, and the age range was 16 to 62. So at 5 in the morning, we found ourselves at a marina on the Hudson River in the shadow of what used to be the World Trade Center, is now Freedom Tower. Obviously a very sobering view that is missing a couple of magnificent buildings. But it also was a reminder that it was a beautiful day and a bright blue sky, and even though it was 5 in the morning, it was obvious that it was going to be a pretty day for us. Now, as we were getting ready, Susan was doing the channel grease for me one more time, and not everybody got a smooch from the CEO, I think, but I did. But the other thing that's interesting, when we started this whole process, I had said earlier that these are not the MBAs of open water swimming. Well, now they are. And now we know that everybody knows what they're doing. I mean, this is as experienced a crew for marathon swimming as exists anywhere in the world. And I'm so pleased that we could pull this together again with Susan's idea to include everyone and so forth. So the swim, I think you remember from the map, we go around kind of the southern end of Manhattan Island and then north on the East River with the benefit of a tidal push that's kind of pushing everyone along. You see how flat this water is. And by the way, everyone asks about how dirty the water was in New York. And the East River is legendary for being so polluted and so forth. And it wasn't bad. I had prepared with a couple of vaccinations and a prescription for a heavy antibiotic. I never even had to fill the antibiotic. That was a pleasant surprise. Now the water was murky. You could never see past your elbow, but it didn't really feel dirty. So we're headed up the East River, and especially compared with the other photographs that you've seen, I mean, there was action all over the place. We had boats, there were bridges, big buildings. I mean, it was a lot of things happening and a lot of confusion much of the time. If you look at that little overlook, Bob Lee is standing there in his bicycling suit. Bob came to New York with us and with his bicycle and bicycled the entire length around the island of Manhattan. And so every time we stopped for a feeding stop or something like that, there's Bob. And it was terrific to see him, and we had other family and friends who were there and so forth. In fact, as we got up toward the Harlem River, one of the things that we discovered is that our liquid Advil was not usable. And so somehow Susan relayed to Mac, who was on the shore, that we needed more children's liquid Advil, and so he was scrambling around Harlem, bodega after bodega, trying to find this product. Ultimately was able to toss it to the boat. I mean, it was all very dramatic. So we went north on the East River until Hell's Gate, which is at about 110th Street, and things got kind of swirly in there and so forth. As we got into the Harlem River, we stopped, and the tide was pulling us backward, and so we sort of swam in place for about 90 minutes. And it was kind of frustrating to look at, as I breathed, I would see the same sights, and that didn't make any sense for a while, and so forth. But the water was actually pulling us back. But you muscle through, and onward you go. So the Harlem River is where I thought we would find the really dirty water. As it turns out, it was not. And my friend and training partner Don McDonald was the kayaker with me, and we spent a lot of time training together, and we have developed together little hand signals for things that he wants me to do: drift right, drift left, stop, whatever the hand signals are. So we're into the Harlem River. It was a bit of a grind, and Don put up the stop sign, and I figured, oh boy, here it comes. There's either a motorboat going to bear down on us, or we're about to hit a big floating garbage or something like that. And I popped my head up and I said, is everything okay? And he goes, oh yeah. He said, I just thought you'd like to see Yankee Stadium. So, now this is a view of Yankee Stadium that not many people get, and there it was, the house that Ruth built. It was almost an emotional time too, because it happened that it was 75 years ago that week that Lou Gehrig had delivered his luckiest man speech at the old Yankee Stadium as we were swimming by. As it turns out, we had originally thought that there would be a Red Sox-Yankees game going on while we were swimming by, but it was a few hours off. So we didn't quite get that. So the Harlem River takes you from 110th Street to about 210th Street, where you take a sharp left at what they call Spuyten-Duyvil, which is Dutch for devil's spit, and I don't know why, but so be it. We took a hard left and found ourselves in the Hudson River, which was magnificently beautiful, very wide and fast-moving, which was nice. And it's in the Hudson where you start to see some of these ocean-going container ships and other commercial traffic. At this part of the Hudson, you'll see the water is still very calm and nice, but it was moving downstream very quickly. In the second half of the Hudson, things did get a little rockier. The wind started to blow. We were up against some the wakes from those big ocean-going ships and so forth. At one point, I got rolled over by a wave, and I was a little frustrated, and I popped up and I said something to Don, who I noticed was doing everything he could in his kayak to try to stay on top of the waves himself, so I wasn't going to complain very much. And so we headed down the Hudson and toward Battery Park. Susan got this photograph. I guess somebody else was getting a smooch that day at Battery Park. This last little video is of the finish of that swim, where, again, having these crowds of people around is very atypical for most people. In watching my stroke on that last little leg, I'm almost embarrassed to watch it because my stroke is falling apart and I'm just moving through the water lethargically almost. At the time, I remember, boy, I am moving along here. To show you how wrong you can be. Kind of a last point here about celebrating a team victory is so important when you have something like this. Again, you get to the end of a project, there's a closing dinner, there's a team dinner, there's something, but you need to have that punchline. And I think it not only is an opportunity to thank everyone, but really to acknowledge everyone on the team and so forth, and it's kind of puts a ribbon around the whole experience. There's a special tradition that they have back in England, that everyone who swims the English Channel is invited to write their name on the wall at a pub. And the pub is called the White Horse. It's been there for 600 years or some crazy thing. And as you go into the White Horse, you start to see names of people you know and people whose names you recognize and from generations ago who've swum the English Channel. And the walls and the ceilings are covered with messages and people's names. The men's room is covered. It's just the names are everywhere. And so we found a wall that included the name of a college friend of mine who had swum the English Channel some years ago and wanted to sign there.
Wait, I don't know this side.
But we also got a more expansive team photo here of all the folks who were there, and it was a pretty special night, of course. And you can see from that photograph the signatures that are on the ceilings and the walls and everything else. The White Horse is a pretty fun place to celebrate after you're done. So just taking a step back, you know, the experience that we've had, you know, we set this goal. The goal obviously expanded over a couple of years into additional swims, and but we were able to knock it down. We've raised what is a ton of money for ALS research. Again, maybe not compared with the ice bucket thing, but it was a ton of money to us. And I became the 88th person to be a Triple Crowner. Of the people who've done the Triple Crown over the age of 50, also known as the Half Century Club, I am 15th on that list. So, so proud of the fact that we had done it with this sort of systematic approach, and really were able to get it done together. We've talked about kind of what's next, and the couple of ideas that are out there. We're sure not going to stop swimming anytime soon, and there are channels in Hawaii and maybe the Strait of Gibraltar that are calling us. And again, as long as we can continue to raise money like we have, why stop now? Left some unfinished business back in France. Susan needed a rock from Vicente. So we took a much more civilized trip across the English Channel on a ferry boat, like one of those that you saw in the photograph, and found the beach where we had landed, and discovered that it, even though we couldn't see it in the middle of the night, it's as pretty as a postcard, and it was quite a day for everyone, I think, and to be able to see that beach when we could actually see it. And Susan got her rock, so it was a pretty good day. So we're flying home, and I talked to Gordy, who did Gordy leave? Maybe he may have gone. Anyway, Gordy was sitting next to me on the flight back from Heathrow, and I said, you know, what do you really take away from all this? You know, we worked our butts off for a couple of years to do this English Channel thing, and we made it across, and so forth. They said, what do you take away from all this? And Gordy, who was 17 at the time, said, well, you know, it's not about the swim. And I thought, okay. And he said, and this is where he said, it was about a ridiculous goal, putting the pieces in place and knocking it down. So, for Gordy, it's not about the swim. Gordy gets the last slide. It really is about fear. It's about feelings of inadequacy and dark and light, and ultimately learning that we are powerful beyond measure. We can thank Nelson Mandela for that quote, but this one's mine.
Hi, I'm Doug McConnell. I swam the English Channel August 21st, 2011 in 14 hours and 18 minutes.
So, thank you. At this point, everybody's probably totally turned off about marathon swimming. But if you have any questions, I'd love to hear. So. Yeah.
So from the business aspect, and you don't have to name names, over the course of the 3 years, did any part of your team want to bail?
If they did, they kept it to themselves.
That's a good team.
You know, one of the other benefits that goes along with being on the team is that you get to take these neat trips. And you know, it was we spent some time in England, obviously, in California, then New York, and for that reason, of course, the team vote is really for that Hawaii channel next. Is the next one, so it's pretty exciting.
I have a question for Susan. When you were on the boat in the channel with your crew, did anyone get a chance to revisit their fish and chips from the night before, or was it?
We didn't eat anything, drink anything, or go potty. It was emergency the whole time. Oh, if anybody threw up?
Yeah.
We all threw up the whole time.
Everybody on board.
Except
But you were chumming behind Doug, not in front of
It
him,
was
right?
terrible.
Right.
It was not like we expected.
Now, again, I don't know if you've ever had motion sickness, but it's just horrible, and it doesn't go away, and it's, so imagine having, doing that for 14 hours.
Well, people who don't make it across become obsessed and then keep trying. And I thought, I hope he makes it so we don't have to do
Yeah.
And any estimate of how much seawater you drink in 14 hours and 18 minutes?
A lot. Especially with those waves, I ended up swallowing and inhaling a lot of seawater, and it takes a while to kind of get that through your system. The inhaling it part was what really surprised. I knew about this, that I would swallow some and so forth, but the inhaling it was really hard, so it felt like I had a bad cold for a few days, as my lungs kind of cleared all that out. But the day after one of these swims, you don't want to be too far from a bathroom. I've also learned that. Yeah.
What's the oldest age that has crossed the English Channel?
73. Interestingly enough, the week that we did it, there was a fellow who was help me, Susan, a surgeon. Yeah, but was he a surgeon or something from Guernsey who was there, and age 70, who swam across a few days after we did, and son of a gun, boy, tough as nails, and made it across. Since then, two older than 70 have done the swim. Most recently, this last summer, a 73-year-old fellow from New Zealand, I believe, made it across. And it's a whale of an undertaking for anyone. But I think that as different older swimmers are starting to rewrite this record book, I remember when I was a senior in college in '79, Jim Councilman, who was the legendary swim coach from Indiana, swam the English Channel, and at age 58, and at the time was the oldest ever. So that age has been marching up pretty steadily. And I don't doubt that there will be older people that, it will continue to march up and so forth. As you see the people who are training in Dover, and there are people at Dover Harbor every day and who are swimming back and forth in the harbor for training purposes and whatnot. It's all shapes and sizes, all ages, it's all nationalities to be sure. People are really hooked on this. And if you look at the numbers of people who are coming to open water swimming, the numbers are exploding, in part because of triathlon, but it's become a very popular sport. So it's fun to be doing.
What's the oldest for the triathlon?
I don't know.
Do you know whether there's just about as many women?
In open water swimming, women outnumber men. And in fact, it's one of the only sports where women and men compete at parity. And in most measured swims, English Channel specifically, the average woman is faster than the average man. Yeah. And there's a bunch of theories. There's a bunch of theories for why that is. If you see age group swimming, also little, kids, high school and below, girls outnumber boys 2-to-1 there too. And it has been argued that boys won't put up with the amount of training that's necessary to, the ratio of training to event is just not their cup of tea. So girls are more patient. Sorry.
How many complete each year?
Of the English Channel? About 100. And the total is about 1,300, forever at this point. And there are about 100 a year that make it across. There are more people who participate in relays that go across the English Channel. And I don't know what that number is, but solo swims, it's about a 50% success rate. And about 100 people. Our year was a little light. I think there were 68 or 70 that made it across, but it was a bad weather year, and so conditions being what they are and stuff like that. Of the people who don't make it across, probably 80+% get out because of the cold. The cold does get to you. It's giving up part. People do, and some people, you know, for whatever reason, their arms hurt or their, you know, their lungs hurt, or they get cold or whatever the issue is. You know, one story that I had read about a number of swimmers, as you're swimming next to the boat, you don't really swim behind the boat, so you can see the boat, you're next to it. And as you're swimming along, our boat, the boat I was following, for example, is a 40-foot fishing boat. And so as you're swimming along next to it, there's a swim platform on the back of the boat that's where I climbed up and so forth. That's how you get in and out of the boat. And I had read other swimmers' accounts of this and saying that if they would just take the ladder off the back of the boat, because as they breathed on that side and they would look at that ladder, because to them the ladder meant I can stop this nonsense and I won't be cold anymore and my shoulders aren't going to hurt anymore and all the rest of the stuff. And it was almost like these ladders were taunting them. You know, but a lot of people mentioned the ladder. So as we were swimming along, I was thinking, okay, we better watch out for that ladder because that's a bad scene, you know, and stuff. Well, I mean, it was 40,000 strokes. I breathed on both sides, so that means that, you know, the 14,000 times I looked at that ladder, not a single time did it occur to me to get off. And I, you know, I don't know, it's, I'm not particularly mentally tough or anything like that, and so forth, but it just never occurred to me to stop. And it was that case, it was that way in England, it was that way when we were getting stung like crazy in Catalina, and in New York as well. I mean, it's, you know, these are all hard swims, but it never occurred to me to get out. So I guess that's probably not a very good answer to your question. But the other thing that we have learned, and I think that we should have this conversation in 20 years to see if our kids learned it or not, is that you really can set a goal. You really can do whatever you want. And it's as nutso as it sounds. You put the pieces in place, and it will come together. And a woman that I know of, I have not ever met her, today finished an 80-mile swim from Eleuthera to Nassau, Bahamas. And she's Australian, and a younger woman, she's 30-ish, I think. But imagine 42 hours and the longest unassisted swim ever done, 128 kilometers or something. And so, you know, for everything that you think that you've done that's remarkable or novel or, you know, whatever, you know, there's somebody like Chloe McCardle who's out there that's, you know, whipping you all over the place. So it's, you know, I think the other, you know, when you start out swimming as a little kid, you know, I loved to race, and I remember swimming in meets, and all I wanted to do was beat the guy in the next lane. And then, in fact, I remember one time having a conversation with my sister when she said, "You're not swimming against the people in the other lane. You're swimming against the clock," and that's a hard concept to kind of get around, and so forth. So as time goes on, as you remain competitive, you're competing against different things. First, it's the guy in the next lane, then it's the clock, then it's the NCAA standard, or it's the national cut, or it's the whatever. And so you just find different things to compete against. Now I'm old enough that I don't have to compete against the clown in the next lane. It's just competing against myself, and you know, we've come up with these crazy ideas, and we've been able to get them done. So I hope we still can. Yes.
Well, I've really been wondering about the cold. Is it a matter of mind over matter, or is it a matter of training, or are some bodies better able to deal with the cold than others?
It is sort of all of the above. It is, I think the training is absolutely a big part of it. The acclimation to cold water is unpleasant, and frankly, the only way to get used to really cold water is to spend a lot of time in really cold water. You know, water that will take your breath away. And it's interesting though, because the first time you get in water like that, you go through the pins and needles feeling, and the breath goes, you know, you can't breathe, and you know, all those little panicky things that you go through. And the second time, it's a lot like the first time. But by the third time, you know what's coming. You know that, and I've learned, for example, that even in water that's in the low 50s, if I can count to 200, I start counting my strokes. If I can get to 200, I know I'm going to be warm. So as soon as you get in the water and you're grappling, struggling to breathe, and so forth, start counting, because you know it's going to be over in 200. And so these little games you play with yourself, and it's partly your body teaching your brain, and partly your brain teaching your body, but ultimately you realize this isn't so bad. I mean, yeah, it's bad for a couple of minutes, but it's not that. You can get through it. Very clearly, though, some body types are better suited for colder water swimming than others, and obviously I am not Tinkerbell. And so I'm, a pretty stout guy, and if you go to other open water, especially cold water, open water swims, everybody's shaped like me. So, women and men. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, you need some extra insulation, and it works. So. Anyway, thank you again. I'm sorry. Bye.
Where did you put the Triple Crown tattoo?
I haven't done that one yet. So. Thanks again for